This old photograph looks peaceful, until you notice what's reflected in her eyes. Dr. Sarah Brennan adjusted her magnifying lamp and leaned closer to the light box on her desk. Outside her small office in the Chicago Historical Society, March wind rattled the windows, but inside, she was lost in 1912. The photograph had arrived 3 days earlier in a donated collection from the estate of Marian Wells, a Jamaican immigrant who had passed away at 103. Among naturalization papers and Ellis Island landing documents, Sarah had found this image. A young black woman in a dark coat and simple hat, standing in the Great Hall, her face turned directly toward the camera. Sarah had cataloged hundreds of Ellis Island photographs. Most showed exhausted families clutching bundles, children with hollow eyes, men in caps staring at uncertain futures. Photographs of black immigrants were rarer. They'd been processed differently, often segregated, their documentation less carefully preserved. This one was remarkable for that reason alone. But there was something else. The woman stood alone, unusually isolated in a hall typically crowded with processing groups. Her posture was unnaturally rigid, and her eyes, there was something about her eyes. Still here? Marcus, the archivist, appeared in her doorway with 2 coffee cups. It's almost 8. Look at this. Sarah gestured to the monitor where she'd scanned the photograph at 1200 DPI. Something's off. Marcus set down the coffees and squinted at the screen. Ellis Island documentation. Probably taken by Augustus Sherman or one of his assistants. He photographed some Caribbean arrivals. But look at her expression. Sarah zoomed in on the woman's face. Everyone else in these photos looks scared, hopeful, confused. She looks aware. Like she's trying to tell us something. Marcus studied the image more carefully. Black immigrants had it worse there. Longer processing times, more medical examinations, higher rejection rates. Maybe that's what you're seeing, the weight of knowing she might be sent back. After he left, Sarah couldn't stop looking. She opened the image in her professional restoration software and began the process she'd performed thousands of times, adjusting contrast, reducing grain, sharpening details that a century had softened. She worked on the woman's face, enhancing the eyes pixel by pixel. The software was good, museum quality, capable of revealing details invisible to the naked eye in aged photographs. Then she saw it. Sarah's hand froze on the mouse. She zoomed in further, her heart suddenly pounding. In the woman's eyes, in the dark brown irises that had captured light from those tall Ellis Island windows, there was a reflection. Not just light, not just the vague shapes she'd expect. Figures, people, movement. She adjusted the clarity filter, her hands trembling slightly. The reflection sharpened. 2 men in uniform. A third person between them, body twisted, arms raised, the unmistakable posture of violence. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered to her empty office. The peaceful photograph of a black woman waiting to enter America had just revealed something else entirely. Evidence of what her eyes had witnessed over a century ago, preserved in silver and light, waiting for someone to finally see. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table in her small Lincoln Park apartment, laptop open, the photograph filling the screen. She'd sent the high-resolution file to her home computer and had been manipulating the image for hours, trying to convince herself she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. Every enhancement made it clearer. The woman's eyes had captured a scene happening behind the photographer, reflected in her pupils like dark mirrors. 2 men in what appeared to be official uniforms. She could make out badges, the shape of caps. A third figure between them, darker-skinned, being restrained or dragged. The posture was unmistakable. Violence, coercion, struggle. At 3 a.m., Sarah finally opened the manila folder that had accompanied the photograph. Marian Wells's great-niece had included a brief family history typed on an old computer and printed out, the margins uneven. My great-aunt Marian arrived at Ellis Island on April 15, 1912, the same day the Titanic survivors were brought to New York. She was 19 years old, traveling from Kingston, Jamaica, with her older brother Samuel. Family oral history says Samuel disappeared at Ellis Island, simply vanished during processing. Marian would never speak about what happened. When we asked, she would only say, "They took him," and said he never existed. She worked as a domestic servant in Brooklyn for 40 years, never married, never returned to Jamaica. She died last December, taking her silence with her. Sarah read the passage again. They took him and said he never existed. Her brother Samuel had disappeared at Ellis Island. On April 15, 1912, she opened her browser and began searching historical records, cross-referencing Ellis Island processing logs with newspaper archives from that week. The first articles were all about the Titanic. The disaster dominated every headline. But on page 9 of the April 17th New York Tribune, buried beneath shipping news, she found something. Negro laborer missing at Ellis Island. Station authorities report a temporary worker of Caribbean origin disappeared on April 15th during processing of Titanic survivors. Officials state the man likely absconded. No investigation deemed necessary. Sarah's pulse quickened. She kept searching and found a shorter notice in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from April 19th. Inquiry dismissed in Ellis Island disappearance. Immigration Commissioner denies request from Negro woman to investigate vanishing of her brother, employed as porter at station. No evidence of wrongdoing, officials state. Woman's appeals rejected. Sarah looked back at the photograph. Marian's eyes, the reflection of violence, the figure being restrained. April 15th, 1912. You saw them take him, Sarah whispered to the image. You saw what they did to Samuel. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then dialed. After 4 rings, a groggy voice answered. Marcus, I know it's late, but I need you to come to my apartment right now. Sarah, it's 3 in the morning. There was a crime at Ellis Island. A black man disappeared in 1912. His sister witnessed it. And I have proof. Marcus arrived 40 minutes later, his coat buttoned wrong, carrying a thermos of coffee. Sarah had printed the enhanced image, Marian's face, then extreme close-ups of each eye, showing the reflected scene with brutal clarity. He spread them across her kitchen table and stared in silence for a full minute. This is impossible, he finally said. The resolution shouldn't be this clear. Photographic emulsions from 1912 couldn't capture this level of detail. But they did. Sarah pulled up her computer screen. I've run every test. It's not manipulated. The reflection is original to the photograph. And look at this. She showed him the newspaper articles about the missing worker. Then she read aloud from the family history about Samuel's disappearance. Marcus read carefully, his expression shifting from skepticism to anger. They dismissed her inquiry, just dismissed it, because she was black. Exactly. Sarah's voice was tight. Caribbean immigrants were already treated as suspicious. After the Titanic chaos, with anti-immigrant sentiment high, a black woman claiming her brother was attacked by guards? They could ignore her completely. Who would believe her? Who would care? Marcus sat down heavily. So you're saying Marian witnessed her brother Samuel being attacked, maybe killed by Ellis Island guards, and somehow that violence was captured as a reflection in her eyes when this photograph was taken? I'm saying she was standing in the Great Hall when it happened. The photographer was documenting arrivals, standard procedure. She must have just seen the attack behind her. Her eyes were still focused on that scene when the shutter clicked. The windows created perfect lighting conditions for reflection. Marcus picked up the close-up of her right eye. The reflected figures were clearer in this one. The uniforms, the violent posture, the victim's raised arms, his dark skin visible even in the tiny reflection. If this is real, if this is evidence, Sarah, this isn't just about Ellis Island. This is about how black immigrants were treated, how their lives were considered disposable, how crimes against them were covered up. That article mentioned Samuel was employed as a porter. Sarah pulled up her research notes. Caribbean workers at Ellis Island were given the worst jobs, hauling luggage, cleaning, manual labor. They had no protections. And if Samuel saw something he wasn't supposed to see, they killed him. Marcus's voice was flat. And when Marian tried to report it, they told her he never existed. The perfect victim, Sarah said quietly. A black immigrant worker during the Titanic crisis. Easy to erase, easy to forget. So what do? We find out exactly what happened to Samuel Wells. We prove that this photograph is evidence of a hate crime that's been buried for over a century. And we make sure Marian's testimony, her witness, is finally heard. The next morning, Sarah stood in the reading room of the New York Public Library, waiting for the archivist to bring the Ellis Island immigration logs from April 1912. Marcus had stayed in Chicago to search the Historical Society's archives for any documentation of Caribbean immigrant experiences during that period. The archivist, an older woman named Helen, returned with 3 large-bound volumes. These cover March through June 1912. Fair warning, record-keeping for non-European immigrants was inconsistent at best, sometimes deliberately incomplete. Sarah opened the April volume carefully. The pages were filled with names, arrival dates, countries of origin, all in careful handwriting. She found April 15th and began scanning down the columns. There, Marian Wells, age 19, Jamaica, single, domestic service, destination, Brooklyn, New York. But no Samuel Wells on that page, or the next, or the day before. Sarah felt frustration rising. She turned back to April 14th, then 13th, scanning every entry. Finally, on April 11th, she found it. Samuel Wells, age 23, Jamaica, single, labor. Destination, Brooklyn, New York. He'd arrived 4 days before his sister. That made sense. He'd come first to find work, then sent for Marian. But there was a notation in the margin, in different handwriting. Detained for additional processing. Sarah photographed the page with her phone and kept searching. In a separate section at the back of the volume, labeled Station Employment Records, she found Samuel's name again. Wells, Samuel, porter, baggage handler, temporary hire, April the 12th, 1912. His employment had ended on April 15th, the day Marian arrived, the day he disappeared. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began cross-referencing with the newspaper articles. The Tribune had mentioned the worker disappeared during processing of Titanic survivors. The Carpathia had arrived with survivors around 9 p.m. on April 15th, but Ellis Island had received advance notice. They'd been preparing all day. She opened the New York Times archives and found a detailed article about the Titanic aftermath. Buried in the 6th paragraph was a line that made her hands shake. Ellis Island Station Superintendent reported unusual congestion in baggage processing areas throughout April 15th, as staff prepared for potential overflow of survivor luggage. Several temporary workers were dismissed early due to irregularities. Samuel had been dismissed or disappeared on April 15th due to irregularities. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Found something. Caribbean Immigrant Aid Society records from 1912. Multiple complaints about Ellis Island guards confiscating luggage, demanding bribes. One complaint specifically mentions Negro porter beaten for interfering. No name given. Date, April 1912. Sarah stared at her phone, then back at the immigration log. Samuel Wells, employed as a baggage porter. Dismissed on April 15th for irregularities. Witnesses reported him being attacked. Marian had tried to report his disappearance and was ignored. The story was becoming clear, and it was worse than she'd imagined. Samuel hadn't just witnessed theft. He'd tried to stop it, and they'd killed him for it, and then erased him from the records. Made him disappear as if he'd never existed. And his sister had seen it all, had stood in that great hall and watched them drag him away, helpless to stop it, knowing that no one would believe a 19-year-old black woman from Jamaica. Sarah looked at the photograph on her screen. Marian's face, dignified and still, her eyes holding a secret for 111 years. "I believe you," Sarah whispered, "and I'm going to prove what they did." Sarah spent the next 3 days in archives across New York City. The Municipal Archives, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. Marcus joined her on the second day, and together they built a timeline of what had happened in April 1912. The picture that emerged was damning. Ellis Island in 1912 was overwhelmed. Immigration had reached record numbers, and the facility was understaffed, underfunded, and rife with corruption. Guards and officials routinely extorted immigrants, demanding bribes for faster processing, stealing valuables from luggage, selling confiscated goods. Caribbean immigrants were particularly vulnerable. They arrived with few possessions, spoke English with accents that marked them as foreign, and had no political power or community organizations strong enough to protect them. The records Marcus found at the Schomburg Center documented dozens of complaints from black immigrants about theft, violence, and discrimination at Ellis Island between 1910 and 1914. "Listen to this," Marcus said, reading from a letter preserved in the Caribbean Immigrant Aid Society files. "It's dated April 20th, 1912, 5 days after Samuel disappeared. We write again to protest the treatment of Negro arrivals at Ellis Island. Our people are robbed systematically. When they complain, they are threatened, beaten, or detained indefinitely. Last week, a young man from Kingston tried to stop guards from stealing from an elderly woman's trunk. He has not been seen since. His sister begs for help, but authorities refuse to investigate." Sarah looked up from her laptop. "That's Marian. That has to be Marian and Samuel." "It is." Marcus showed her another document, a handwritten petition with 15 signatures. At the top, Marian Wells, Brooklyn, New York. She didn't just report it once. She kept trying for months. She went to the Aid Society, to churches, to anyone who would listen, and everyone told her the same thing. Without a body, without witnesses willing to testify, without official records, there was nothing they could do. Sarah felt anger burning in her chest. They made him disappear completely. No death certificate, no deportation record, no indication he ever worked there. Just gone. Because he was black and expendable and in the way. Marcus's voice was bitter. "You know what else I found? 3 other Caribbean workers disappeared from Ellis Island between 1911 and 1913. 3. All men, all porters or laborers, all during periods of high immigrant volume. No investigations, no accountability." Sarah pulled up the photograph on her laptop, the enhanced image of Marian's eyes, the reflected scene of violence. "This is the only evidence that survived. The only proof that Samuel existed, that what happened to him was real. Then we need to make it count." Marcus leaned forward. "We need to find out exactly who those guards were. Build a case strong enough that historians can't ignore it. And we need to find Marian's family. They deserve to know the truth." Sarah nodded slowly. "The family history mentioned she worked as a domestic servant in Brooklyn for 40 years. If we can track her employment records, tax documents, maybe census data, we can find out where she lived, who she worked for, who she knew." Marcus was already typing on his phone. "And maybe, just maybe, she told someone. Maybe she kept a diary, wrote letters, something." "After 111 years?" Sarah's voice was skeptical. "After 111 years of silence," Marcus corrected. "Maybe someone in her family held on to something. A name, a story, a reason why she never married, never went back to Jamaica, never stopped looking over her shoulder." Sarah looked at Marian's face in the photograph, at the dignified set of her jaw, the careful blankness of her expression. A 19-year-old woman who had crossed an ocean with her brother, who had watched him be murdered, who had spent the rest of her life knowing that the world didn't care. "We're going to tell your story," Sarah promised the image. Every word of it. That evening, Sarah called the number listed on the donation papers. Marian's great-niece, Catherine, who lived in Brooklyn. The phone rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Catherine Morrison? My name is Dr. Sarah Brennan. I'm a historian at the Chicago Historical Society. I'm calling about your great-aunt Marian's photograph collection." There was a long pause. "Is something wrong? I donated those fair and square." "Nothing's wrong. Actually, I've discovered something extraordinary in one of the photographs, something that might finally explain what happened to Marian's brother Samuel. Another pause, longer this time. When Catherine spoke again, her voice was different, softer, almost afraid. You found something about Uncle Samuel? Yes, and I'd like to meet with you to discuss it. Would that be possible? Dr. Brennan? Catherine said slowly. My great-aunt Marian died believing her brother was murdered at Ellis Island. She spent her whole life trying to prove it. Are you telling me you have evidence? Sarah looked at the enhanced photograph on her screen, at the reflection in Marian's eyes, at the proof that had hidden there for more than a century. Yes, I am. 2 days later, Sarah and Marcus stood on the front steps of a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. The neighborhood had gentrified dramatically in recent years, but Catherine's building retained its original character. Worn stone steps, iron railings, a heavy wooden door with a brass knocker. Catherine answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door. She was in her mid-50s, tall and elegant, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a bun. Her eyes, dark brown and intense, reminded Sarah immediately of Marian's photograph. Dr. Brennan? Mr. Williams? She shook their hands firmly. Please, come in. The apartment was filled with photographs that covered nearly every wall. Old sepia prints in ornate frames, black and white snapshots, faded Polaroids, family history documented across a century. I'm a family genealogist, Catherine explained, leading them into a dining room where she'd spread documents across a large oak table. It's been my project for 20 years, tracing our family from Jamaica to New York, but there's always been a gap, a missing piece. Samuel. She gestured to the documents. Birth certificates, ship manifests, naturalization papers, death certificates, a complete family tree, except for one branch that ended abruptly in 1912. Marian never gave up, Catherine continued. She kept every scrap of paper related to Samuel, every letter she wrote to officials, every response she received, every dead end. She pulled out a worn leather folder. This is what she left me. I've read it 100 times, hoping I missed something. Sarah opened the folder carefully. Inside were yellowed letters, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes in careful cursive. Marian's own investigation, conducted over decades, without resources, without support, without hope of justice. One letter, dated June 3rd, 1912, was addressed to the Ellis Island Commissioner. Sir, I write again to beg your assistance in locating my brother Samuel Wells, who disappeared from your station on April 15th of this year. I was present and witnessed men in uniform taking him forcibly from the baggage area. When I inquired, I was told no such person worked there, but I have his employment notice. I have his letter telling me he was hired. I have his promise to meet me when I arrived. Sir, my brother existed. He was real. Please, I beg you, tell me what happened to him. The response, on official letterhead, was brief and cruel. Miss Wells, our records show no employment of any Samuel Wells. You're mistaken. Further inquiries on this matter will not be answered. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. She looked up at Catherine, who was watching her carefully. She tried everything, Catherine said quietly. The police, immigration officials, lawyers who wouldn't take her case, newspapers that wouldn't print her story. By 1915, she'd given up hope of finding him, but she never stopped believing what she saw. She didn't imagine it, Marcus said firmly. He pulled out his laptop and opened the enhanced photograph. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to prepare yourself. What we're about to show you is disturbing, but it's also proof that Marian was telling the truth. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as Marcus turned the screen toward her. He'd prepared a presentation, first the full photograph, then progressively closer images of Marian's face, then finally the extreme close-ups of her eyes, with the reflected scene clearly visible. Catherine stared in silence for nearly a minute. Then her hand rose to her mouth, and tears began streaming down her face. Oh, God, she whispered. Oh, God, she saw it. She really saw it. Yes, Sarah's voice was gentle. She witnessed her brother being attacked by guards. And this photograph captured that moment, captured what her eyes were seeing when it was taken. Catherine couldn't look away from the screen. All those years, everyone told her she was confused, traumatized, mistaken. They said Samuel had run away or had never existed at all. And she knew. She knew what she'd seen. We believe Samuel tried to stop guards from stealing from immigrants' luggage, Marcus explained. We found complaints from other Caribbean workers about systematic theft and extortion at Ellis Island during this period. When Samuel interfered, they killed him. Then they erased him from the records. Because he was black, Catherine said flatly. Because his life didn't matter to them. Yes, Sarah said simply. There was no point in softening it. Catherine wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. When she looked at them again, her expression had changed. Grief mixed with determination. What do you need from me? Everything you have, Sarah said. Every document Marian saved, every story passed down in your family, every detail about what happened after April 15. We're going to build a complete case. We're going to prove what happened to Samuel. And we're going to make sure Marian's witness testimony, held in her eyes for over a century, is finally recognized. Catherine nodded slowly, then reached for a wooden box on the sideboard. Then there's something else you need to see. Marian kept a journal. She started it the day she arrived at Ellis Island and wrote in it almost every day until she died. I've never shown it to anyone. I wasn't sure. She paused, holding the box. I wasn't sure anyone would believe her. We believe her, Marcus said. Catherine opened the box and pulled out a small leather-bound book, its pages brown with age. She handed it to Sarah with both hands, like passing on something sacred. Then helped me tell her story. Sarah spent that night in her hotel room reading Marian's journal by lamplight. The entries were written in careful, precise handwriting, the script of someone who'd learned English as a second language and took pride in getting every letter right. The first entry was dated April 15th, 1912. I have arrived in America, but I have lost Samuel. I watched them take him, 2 guards with clubs. He was trying to help an old woman. They were going through her trunk, taking her things. Samuel stepped forward and said, "That's not right." They grabbed him, dragged him through a door. I tried to follow, but another guard pushed me back into the line. They took my photograph, made me stand still and smile, but I could not smile. I could only see what they had done to my brother. The photographer said, "Look here," and I looked, but I was seeing Samuel being taken away. I was seeing him disappear. Now they tell me he was never here at all, but I know what I saw. I will remember. I will always remember. The entries continued, daily at first, then weekly, then monthly as years passed. Each one documented Marian's attempts to find answers, her encounters with officials who dismissed her, her growing isolation in a country that didn't want to hear her truth. May 18th, 1912. Went to police station in Manhattan. Officer laughed when I said my brother disappeared from Ellis Island, said maybe he didn't want to be found, as if Samuel would abandon me, as if he didn't promise to take care of me in this new country. July 18th, 1912. Caribbean Aid Society wrote to Ellis Island on my behalf. Received response today. They say no record of Samuel's employment exists, but I have his letter. He wrote to tell me he'd found work, that he'd meet me when I arrived. How can they say he was never there? December 1st, 1912. I have stopped looking, not because I don't believe, but because no one else does. I work now for a family in Brooklyn. They are kind enough, but I am invisible to them, just as Samuel has become invisible to everyone. But I carry him with me, every day, every breath. The entries grew more philosophical over time, less about the search and more about memory witness and the burden of knowing a truth that no one else acknowledges. April 15th, 1920. 8 years today since I lost Samuel. I went to Ellis Island this morning, stood outside the gates. I could not bring myself to go in, but I needed to be close to the last place he existed. I have learned something about America in these 8 years. Some lives count more than others. Some deaths matter more than others. Samuel's life, his death, they don't matter to this country, but they matter to me, and I will carry his memory until I die, because someone must. April 15th, 1945. 33 years. I am 52 years old now, older than Samuel ever got to be. I dreamed of him last night. He was young, smiling, wearing the jacket he wore on the ship. He said, "Marian, you don't have to carry this alone anymore." But I do. Who else will remember? Who else will know that Samuel Wells existed, that he tried to do right, that he was murdered for it? Sarah had to stop reading several times, overwhelmed by the weight of Marian's isolation. Here was a woman who'd spent her entire life as a witness to an atrocity that no one would acknowledge, carrying the burden of truth completely alone. The final entry was dated December 10th, 2024, just 3 weeks before Marian died. I am 131 years old according to the new calendar they use now, though I tell people 103 because the math is simpler. Catherine, my great-niece, takes care of me. She's kind. She listens to my stories about Samuel. She believes me, I think, or at least she doesn't tell me I'm confused like the others do. I have been thinking about that day, April 15th, 1912. I have been thinking about standing in that great hall, seeing Samuel dragged away, and then the man with the camera saying, "Look here, miss." And I looked. I looked right at him, but I was seeing Samuel. I wonder if the camera saw what I saw. I wonder if anyone will ever look closely enough to see the truth reflected in my eyes. Probably not. But I have done my duty. I witnessed. I remembered. I never stopped believing. That will have to be enough. Sarah closed the journal, her vision blurred with tears. Marian had known. Somehow, instinctively, she'd known that the photograph might hold evidence. She'd hoped, even in her final days, that someone would look closely enough to see. And now someone had. Sarah opened her laptop and wrote an email to Marcus and Catherine. Marian's journal confirms everything. She witnessed the attack on Samuel. She tried for decades to get justice. She died, still hoping someone would believe her. We can't bring Samuel back, but we can do what Marian couldn't. We can prove what happened. We can make people see. I'm going back to the archives tomorrow to identify the guards who worked Ellis Island baggage processing on April 15th, 1912. It's time to name names. She hit send, then looked at the photograph of Marian on her screen. 19 years old, standing alone in the great hall, her eyes holding a secret that had finally been revealed. "I see you," Sarah whispered. "I see what you saw. And I'm going to make sure everyone else does too." The Ellis Island Immigration Museum archives were housed in a climate-controlled basement that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. Sarah had secured special access through her institutional credentials, and the head archivist, an elderly man named Robert Chen, had agreed to help her search employment records from 1912. "You're looking for guards and staff who worked baggage processing on a specific date?" Robert adjusted his glasses and pulled out a large ledger. That's unusual. Most researchers want passenger records. I'm investigating a death that may have been covered up, Sarah said carefully. A Caribbean worker who disappeared on April 15th, 1912. Robert's expression shifted. The same day the Titanic survivors arrived. That was chaos. Between the regular immigrant processing and preparing for potential survivor overflow, he shook his head. I've worked in these archives for 30 years. I've seen documentation of some terrible things that happened here. The corruption, the abuse of power. But disappearances were worst, because without a body, without witnesses, there was no crime. He opened the ledger and began turning pages. Here, April 1912, station employment roster. He ran his finger down columns of names. The baggage processing area had 12 staff on April 15th. 10 regular employees, 2 temporary supervisors brought in for the Titanic preparations. Sarah pulled out her notebook. Can you give me those names? Robert read them aloud while Sarah wrote, regular staff, Michael O'Brien, Thomas Murphy, John Schmidt, Peter Larson. He continued through the list, then reached the temporary supervisors. And the 2 temps, George Patterson and James Wilson. Both listed as experienced guards transferred from Manhattan Police Department for crowd control expertise. Sarah's pen froze. Police officers working as Ellis Island guards? It happened sometimes, during high-volume periods. They'd bring in NYPD for extra security. Robert pulled out another file. According to this, Patterson and Wilson were there for 1 week only, April 12th through 18th, right when Samuel Wells was working there, Sarah said quietly. And they disappeared from the records right after he did. She spent the next 3 hours going through personnel files. Most of the regular employees had long service records, detailed documentation, pension files after they retired, but Patterson and Wilson's files were thin, just basic transfer paperwork. No details about their NYPD backgrounds, no follow-up after their week at Ellis Island. This doesn't make sense, Robert said, frowning at Wilson's file. Every employee should have an exit interview form, a final payment record, something. These 2 just stop, like they were never here after April 18th. Can we find their NYPD records? We'd need to go to the police department archives, but Robert pulled out one more document, a memo dated April 20th, 1912. And look at this. It's from the Ellis Island superintendent to the immigration commissioner. Sarah read aloud, regarding the temporary security arrangements during Titanic survivor processing, the borrowed personnel from Manhattan Police performed adequately, but will not be requested for future assignments due to irregularities in their conduct. No further details will be recorded per verbal agreement with Police Commissioner Rhinelander Waldo. No further details will be recorded, Marcus repeated when Sarah called him from the archives. That's a cover-up. They knew something happened, and they deliberately buried it. Patterson and Wilson did something bad enough that Ellis Island didn't want them back, but not bad enough, or too politically sensitive to prosecute, Sarah said. And I'll bet you anything Samuel Wells witnessed it. Or tried to stop it, Marcus added. A black immigrant worker standing up to white police officers in 1912. That's a death sentence. Sarah looked at her notes. George Patterson. James Wilson. After 112 years, she finally had names. I'm going to the NYPD archives tomorrow. If Patterson and Wilson went back to police work, there might be records of their careers, complaints against them, anything that shows a pattern. And I'll search newspaper databases for their names, Marcus said. If they were involved in anything else controversial, it might have made the papers. Marcus, Sarah said slowly, what if Samuel wasn't the only one? What if Patterson and Wilson had done this before? There was a long silence on the phone. Then we're not just solving one murder. We're uncovering something much bigger. That evening, Sarah met Catherine at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. She'd brought copies of everything she'd found, the employment records, the superintendent's memo, the names of the 2 guards. Catherine stared at the names for a long time. George Patterson, James Wilson. The men who killed my great-uncle finally have faces. We don't have proof they killed him yet, Sarah cautioned. But they were there, they were in positions of authority, and something they did was bad enough to get them quietly removed from Ellis Island. What happens now? Now we find out everything about Patterson and Wilson, their backgrounds, their careers, their records. We build a case that shows they had means, motive, and opportunity. And we connect them to the image reflected in Marian's eyes. Catherine pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a photograph. This is Marian at age 70, at my mother's wedding. See her expression? That's the same look she had in the Ellis Island photo, like she's seeing something no one else can see. Sarah looked at the image. Marian older, grayer, but with the same dignified posture, the same careful blankness in her expression. A woman who'd learned to hide her knowledge, to protect herself by appearing to remember nothing. She lived her whole life as a witness, Catherine said softly. Never able to testify, never able to get justice, just carrying the truth inside her, alone. She's not alone anymore, Sarah said firmly. We're her voice now, and we're going to make sure her testimony is finally heard. The NYPD archives occupied a fortified building in Lower Manhattan, accessible only by appointment and with extensive security clearance. Sarah had pulled strings through the Chicago Historical Society, claiming her research was for a book about early 20th century immigration enforcement. It had taken 2 weeks to get approval. The records clerk, a young woman named Jennifer, led Sarah into a room lined with filing cabinets. Pre-1920 personnel files are here. Fair warning, they're incomplete. There was a fire in 1932 that destroyed a lot of early records. Sarah's heart sank. How incomplete? Depends on the name. What are you looking for? George Patterson and James Wilson both worked as officers around 1912. Jennifer typed into an old computer terminal. Patterson, George, yes, we have a file. Looks substantial. Wilson, James, she frowned. More common name. We have 3 James Wilsons from that era. You'll need to narrow it down. She pulled Patterson's file first, a thick folder filled with papers. Sarah opened it carefully and began reading. George Patterson had joined the NYPD in 1907, worked in the Lower East Side precinct, and had been involved in numerous complaints, excessive force, taking bribes, harassment of immigrants, but nothing had been officially substantiated. His record showed he'd been temporarily reassigned to Ellis Island in April 1912, then returned to NYPD in May 1912. Then, in August 1912, his record ended abruptly. The final entry was a notice of dismissal, conduct unbecoming an officer, terminated effective August 15, 1912. No details, no explanation, just gone. Sarah photographed every page, then moved to the James Wilson files. She eliminated 2 of the 3 based on assignment dates and locations. The 3rd James Wilson had a remarkably similar trajectory to Patterson. Hired in 1905, multiple complaints about mistreatment of immigrants, temporary reassignment to Ellis Island in April 1912, returned to NYPD in May 1912, and dismissal in September 1912 for conduct unbecoming. Both men had been fired within months of returning from Ellis Island, both times with vague language that suggested something serious but provided no details. Sarah called Marcus immediately. They were both fired. Patterson in August, Wilson in September. Something happened after they came back from Ellis Island that got them kicked off the force. Let me search newspaper archives for their names around those dates, Marcus said. She heard typing in the background. Patterson, George, NYPD, here. Oh my God, Sarah. What? New York Tribune, August 12, 1912. Police officer arrested in extortion scheme. Officer George Patterson of the Lower East Side Precinct was arrested yesterday for extorting money from immigrant families, threatening deportation if they refused to pay. Patterson's partner, Officer James Wilson, is also under investigation. Both officers were recently assigned to Ellis Island during the Titanic rescue operations. Sarah felt her pulse racing. They were running an extortion ring. And it wasn't their first time, Marcus continued. There's a follow-up article from August 20th. It says Patterson and Wilson had been operating the scheme for at least 2 years, targeting Caribbean and Italian immigrants specifically. The investigation started after... He paused. After a complaint from the Caribbean Immigrant Aid Society in June 1912, the same organization that had tried to help Marian find Samuel. Oh, Marcus, what if the complaint wasn't just about extortion? What if someone from the Aid Society heard about Samuel's disappearance and started investigating Patterson and Wilson? Then the extortion charges might have been what they could prove, but Samuel's murder was what they were really after. Sarah looked at the personnel files spread across the table. We need the trial records. If Patterson and Wilson were prosecuted, there would have been testimony, evidence, maybe even mention of Ellis Island. 2 hours later, she was in the Manhattan Criminal Court archives, pulling case files from 1912. The trial records for People v. Patterson and People v. Wilson were surprisingly detailed. Both men had been convicted of extortion and corruption, sentenced to 3 years in prison, and released early in 1914 for good behavior. But buried in the testimony transcripts, Sarah found something crucial. A witness named Thomas Chen, identified as a translator for the Caribbean Immigrant Aid Society, had testified, I worked with many families who complained of officers Patterson and Wilson. They would go to immigrant neighborhoods and demand money, saying they could have people deported. But there was something else. In April 1912, a young woman from Jamaica came to our office. Her brother had disappeared from Ellis Island. She said she saw guards attack him. She was terrified to report it officially, but she gave me 2 names, George and James. She said they wore police uniforms, not immigration service. I didn't connect it to Patterson and Wilson until they were arrested months later for the extortion scheme. Sarah photographed the page with trembling hands. Here was testimony, on the record, connecting Patterson and Wilson to Samuel's disappearance. It had been given under oath in 1912, but no one had followed up. The focus had been on provable extortion, not an unprovable murder. But now, 112 years later, Sarah had proof. She had the photograph with the reflected violence in Marian's eyes. She had Patterson and Wilson's names. She had their criminal records. She had testimony connecting them to Samuel's disappearance. She had everything Marian had never been able to get. That night, Sarah, Marcus, and Catherine met in Sarah's hotel room. Sarah had printed everything, the employment records, the criminal trial transcripts, the newspaper articles, the enhanced photograph showing the reflected scene in Marian's eyes. They spread it all across the bed and floor, creating a timeline of events. April 11th, 1912. Samuel Wells arrives at Ellis Island, gets hired as porter. April 12-14, Samuel works in baggage processing, where Patterson and Wilson are supervising April 15th. Marian arrives. Samuel witnesses Patterson and Wilson stealing from immigrants. They attack him. Marian sees the attack. Samuel disappears. April 20th, Ellis Island. Superintendent quietly sends Patterson and Wilson back to NYPD with vague complaint about irregularities. June 1912. Caribbean Aid Society begins investigating Patterson and Wilson after hearing about Samuel August, 1912. Patterson and Wilson arrested for extortion scheme. Testimony mentions a disappeared worker from Ellis Island, but no charges filed September 1912. Both officers convicted and imprisoned. Samuel's case never investigated. They murdered him and got away with it, Catherine said, her voice hollow. Even when they were caught for other crimes, even when someone testified about Samuel, nothing happened. Because Samuel was black and a temporary worker and had been erased from the records, Marcus said. Without a body, without official documentation that he'd even worked there was no case. But now we have evidence, Sarah said, holding up the enhanced photograph. Marian's eyes captured the moment. This image shows Patterson and Wilson attacking someone in the baggage area on April 15, 1912. Combined with the testimony, the employment records, their criminal convictions, we can prove what happened. Catherine looked at the photograph of her great-aunt's eyes, at the reflected violence held there for more than a century. Can we really? Prove it, I mean? Enough that history will acknowledge it? Yes, Sarah said firmly. We can prove that Samuel Wells existed, that he worked at Ellis Island, that he witnessed corruption, and that George Patterson and James Wilson murdered him to silence him. We can prove that Marian spent her life trying to get justice and was systematically ignored. We can prove all of it. Then let's do it, Catherine said. Let's tell Samuel's story, and Marian's. Let's make sure the world finally knows their names. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Ellis Island Immigration Museum looking at a new permanent exhibit. The centerpiece was Marian's photograph, enlarged to 4 feet tall, with detailed close-ups of her eyes showing the reflected scene of violence. The exhibit was titled The Witness, Marian Wells and the Hidden Crime of Ellis Island. It told the complete story: Samuel's arrival and employment, Patterson and Wilson's corruption, the murder Marian had witnessed, her decades of fighting for justice, the criminal convictions that had never addressed Samuel's death, and finally the photographic evidence that had remained hidden in plain sight for 112 years. Visitors moved slowly through the exhibit, reading Marian's journal entries displayed on the walls, examining the evidence Sarah and Marcus had compiled, seeing the faces of Patterson and Wilson next to their criminal records. The exhibit didn't shy away from the truth. Samuel Wells had been murdered by white police officers because he'd tried to protect immigrant families from theft. His murder had been covered up because his life as a black Caribbean immigrant had been considered disposable, and his sister Marian had spent 103 years carrying the burden of witnessing a crime that no one would acknowledge. But the exhibit also celebrated Marian's persistence, her refusal to forget, her faith that someday someone would see what she had seen. Catherine stood beside Sarah, tears streaming down her face as she watched visitors read her great-aunt's words. She would have loved this, Catherine whispered. After all those years of people telling her she was wrong, confused, imagining things, to see her truth displayed like this, believed, honored. She was an extraordinary woman, Sarah said. A witness who never stopped witnessing, even when the world refused to listen. Marcus joined them, carrying a newspaper. The New York Times published their article this morning, front page of the arts section. He showed them the headline, Hidden in Her Eyes, How a 1912 Photograph Revealed a Century-Old Murder. The article had already sparked national conversation. Historians were re-examining Ellis Island records, looking for other disappeared workers. Civil rights organizations were citing Marian's case as evidence of systematic violence against black immigrants. Descendants of other Ellis Island victims were coming forward with their own family stories of unexplained disappearances. The photograph had opened a door that had been sealed for more than a century. A young black woman approached the exhibit, maybe 20 years old, and stood for a long time in front of Marian's enlarged photograph. She read every word of the display, examined every document. Finally, she turned to Catherine. Was she your family? My great-aunt, Catherine said. Marian Wells. She died last year. I'm sorry. The young woman looked back at the photograph. But I'm glad her story is being told. I'm glad someone finally listened to her. She paused, then added quietly, My great-grandmother came through Ellis Island in 1915, from Trinidad. She used to say, they treated us like we were invisible. Looking at this exhibit, I understand now what she meant. They didn't just treat you like you were invisible, they tried to make you actually disappear. But they didn't succeed, Catherine said firmly. Marian made sure of that. She witnessed. She remembered. She never let them erase Samuel completely. The young woman nodded, then moved on to read more of the exhibit. Sarah watched her go, watched other visitors taking photographs, reading testimonies, learning names that had been deliberately forgotten. This was what history was supposed to do, she thought. Not just preserve the victories and celebrate the powerful, but recover the silenced voices, believe the dismissed witnesses, and restore dignity to those who had been erased. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the exhibit alone. The museum was closing, but she had special permission to stay. She stood in front of Marian's photograph, the young woman in the Great Hall, eyes holding a secret for 112 years, and felt the weight of everything they'd uncovered. Samuel Wells had tried to do the right thing and had been murdered for it. Marian Wells had witnessed that murder and had spent her entire life trying to get justice, only to be dismissed and ignored. George Patterson and James Wilson had committed murder, served minimal time for lesser crimes, and had their victims forgotten. But now, finally, the truth was visible. The witness had been heard. The crime had been acknowledged. Sarah thought about Marian's final journal entry, wondering if a camera could capture what the eyes had seen. Marian had hoped, even at the end, that someone would look closely enough, and someone had. Your witness mattered, Sarah said softly to the photograph. Samuel existed. He was real. He was brave. And what happened to him was wrong. And now, because you never stopped believing, the world knows. The photograph seemed to look back at her, a 19-year-old woman standing in the Great Hall of Ellis Island on April 15, 1912, seeing her brother dragged away to his death, knowing that no one would believe her, but bearing witness anyway. Bearing witness because someone had to. Bearing witness because maybe, someday, someone would see. And finally, after 112 years of waiting, someone had.